Dr. Robbins, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask you to just make a few opening comments, and then we're going to go to questions.
Oh, well, first let me say thanks for having me on Constituting America. I love what you do. I think this is extremely important, bringing your message particularly to American youth in these days when people don't always hear these messages. So I think it's really wonderful. Do you want me to just start talking about Iran? Is that we're just going to dive right in?
Yeah, I would definitely just dive right in and give us just sort of an overview, and we will go to questions.
Okay, great. Well, when we're talking about Iran, so it's a country located in the Middle East, west of Afghanistan, east of Iraq, on the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. A very ancient nation, part of the cradle of civilization, the site of ancient Persia. Currently about 87 million people and very focused on, their economy is very focused on energy with major supplies of oil and natural gas. So, I mean, that's just to contextualize the country. When we're talking about their constitution, we go back to December of 1979 when it was instituted. And in that year, earlier in that year, in the spring, they had a revolution where the previous ruler, the Shah of Iran, was overthrown by a coalition of different groups. There were some liberals, there were some communists, and there were some Islamists who overthrew the Shah and instituted a new government. Well, gradually, the Islamists pushed the other people out of the coalition, and they seized power themselves and put in place this new constitution. And they were led by the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini. He was a leader of the Shiite sect of Islam, which is globally a minority sect in Islam, but in Iran, it's the dominant sect. It's 95% of the people are Shiites. And they established an Islamic Republic. That's the form of government that they call it under their constitution. It's a theocracy based on Islamic principles. So the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad and the traditions of Muhammad very much inform the law in Iran and their way of looking at law. And if you look at their constitution just on paper, it looks a lot like our Constitution in some respects. Like they have a legislature, they have an executive, they have a judiciary, they have a series of rights that are guaranteed under law. And just in that respect, you might say, oh, that's very similar to what we have in the United States. But in fact and in practice, these similarities are very superficial. Because Iran is run as an authoritarian theocracy in which the political process and the rights it's all run by the religious authorities. So however it may look, in fact, it's very tightly controlled. And the way they do this is through a mechanism called Velayat-e-Faqih, which is the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. That's like the framing concept for the whole thing. And what it means is that the supreme leader, whoever the top religious authority is the person who will essentially give rulings that will run everything. And so that's the power is kind of combined into that person. And there's no like check and balance like in our system. That person is the supreme leader, and basically their word is law. So the supreme leader has the power to appoint government officials, including in some cases the president or the chief of the judiciary, the heads of the military and the security agencies. And also the supreme leader has power over various institutions in Iranian politics that kind of control things. For example, there's something called the Guardian Council, which is responsible for picking who gets to run for public office and ensure that all laws are in concert with Islamic principles. There's also something called the Assembly of Experts, which is an advisory body for the supreme leader and also helps get to pick the next supreme leader, whoever that may be. So because of this, this is how they control the elections. Like, you could look at Iran when they're having a presidential election or some other kind of election and say, oh, they're free to vote like we are. You know, they're like a democracy. Well, kind of, but in fact, the candidates that people get to vote for are tightly controlled. It's not like you just say, you know what, I'm going to run for office. Darn it, I want to create change and I'm going to get out there and raise money and run for office like in this country. You can't really do that in Iran. You have to be an approved candidate. So right away, your choices are limited by who the guardians say you can vote for. It's very similar to the way that's elections, quote unquote, would run in a communist country. Like, only an approved party member could run. Well, the same in Iran. Only if you're approved by the guardians can you even stand for office. So it's not the same kind of democracy. Your choice is limited to those they have already chosen for you. The current president, Ibrahim Raisi, is a religious leader. That's not always true in Iran. Sometimes the president is not a cleric, but in this case he is, and he's very much tied to the current Ayatollah Khamenei, and may in fact be the next supreme leader of Iran. We don't know, but he's a case in point. Like, he was chosen to run for that office, and then he ran for that office, and then he won. Okay, big surprise. So in addition to these kind of formal mechanisms of control, the leadership also exercises influence through control of the media. Like, the press isn't really free in Iran. It's particularly the TV and the radio, things like that are very much controlled. The education system is, again, controlled by Islamic strictures. And of course, the religious establishment is completely controlled. So this allows the leadership to try to shape public opinion towards its views of what is a just Islamic state. Then when you look at, so that's all like the structural side of it. And when you look at the rights that are guaranteed under their constitution, again, it looks pretty good. You've various rights that we might recognize, but they're always caveats, the way that it's written in their constitution. Like, you can have free speech so long as it's in concert with Islamic law. Or, you can have the right to freedom of religion, provided you're not doing something they don't like. I mean, there's always like a caveat at the end, like provided by law or, be under Islamic control or something. So what that really tells you is it's not a right at all. It's just a statement that they've made probably for global consumption. It makes it look good, but in fact it isn't. So like freedom of worship, which is guaranteed under Iran's constitution. Well, you're free to worship only if you're one of the approved religions. And of course, Shiite Islam is approved. Christianity is approved. Zoroastrianism, which is an ancient Persian religion, is approved. And Judaism, surprisingly, is an approved religion under Islam. So if you're in one of those faiths, you can worship somewhat freely, at least you can be there. If you're another religion, like, Hindu or Baha'i or, Buddhist or something, no, it's illegal. And even the other religions, you can't really be too out there with your worship. You have to kind of tone it down. Free speech, again, guaranteed within the parameters set by the supreme leader. So criticizing the supreme leader, for example, not really approved of. Other kinds of revolutionary free speech, they don't want to hear about it. Women do not have equal rights in Iran. There are various requirements for women, like wearing a hijab or dressing modestly. And you may recently have seen footage of protests in Iran where women are out in public, like tearing off the hijab and slinging it around. And some of these women are getting arrested. And one of them was even killed recently for protesting this. There's something called the Guidance Patrol, which is like this morality police. It's a real police force in Iran. And they go around enforcing laws like this. A woman isn't wearing her hijab, these guys are going to arrest her, or some other offense against the morality of the Islamic Republic is happening. Well, these police will come and haul you away because they're going to have a, just society and Islamic society, whether you like it or not. If you have an LGBTQ lifestyle, well, that's punishable by death. And they go to great lengths to publicize this too, with public hangings of people who might be gay. So if you're into that type of alternative lifestyle, Iran is not your place. Ethnic minorities, the Kurds, the Baluchis, Azeris, and other national groups like that have very restricted rights in Iran. The Iranians are afraid that some of these groups might want to split off from Iran, form their own independent country, or join another neighboring country that's of their same ethnic group. So they severely restrict these people. If you, for example, teach the language, like the Azeri language in a school, you can be executed for that. They don't want these ethnic minorities to be having their own kind of ethnic space, their own kind of national space to express themselves. And so they severely restrict it. So if I could just sum up this, it's on paper, the Iranian constitution may look like it has some similarities to ours, but in practice, it's a very restrictive theocracy, an authoritarian state, some might call it a totalitarian state, where freedoms are pretty much an illusion. And if the theocracy decides that you're a threat to them, they have very severe ways to punish you and to enforce their will on you.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview. And I was actually surprised at some of the similarities, at least, between the Iranian constitution and our own. Janine, I know you probably got some great questions, and so we could go to you first, if that's okay.
Hi, well, thank you, Dr. Robbins. That was really very informative. It's really good to learn about the details in the news these days. It's funny, in the olden days, people used to read newspapers and get really thorough perspectives. At least it might be ideological, but at least it was in depth. And I'm sure everybody worried about television. It's like, oh, when you watch television, you're just hearing little clips of what they want to feed you. And now we think television is a thorough, and social media is not thorough. So it really is great to have these studies where we can hear from scholars such as yourself to understand comparative governments. I think this is one of the things that Tova loves so much.
Tova's an expert. She was telling us before.
Yeah. Well, she loves comparative government. She's always which I do too. I think it's really interesting. I heard you talk about the differences of they don't have any where you would be condemned, the different arenas where they'll be condemned, such as religion and certain religions and things of that nature. Talk to us about what kind of government do they have? What kind of do they have a constitution like ours?
Oh, sure. Well, not like ours. They have a constitution. It's a written constitution. It sets up that type of form of government, like we were saying, a theocracy. And in a way, it's similar to the way that communist parties in the early part of the 20th century set up governments, where you have a sort of administrative apparatus of like the people, the bureaucrats, and the people who do all of the things that need to be done, to keep the society running, who are kind of the worker bees. And that's where there's sort of an illusion of democracy. You can choose some of those people from the approved list, but the real power is in the religious authorities, which they exercise through these various mechanisms, like controlling who can run for office and controlling the religious police and the morality police and things like that. So that it's almost like a shadow government on top of what we would consider to be the real government. But in their system, the quote unquote real government is actually powerless. And it's this group of religious leaders who really run the show.
Well, it's very much so God. They are, I think, not. Yeah. Well, so what they're saying is through religion, God is in charge.
Well, that's what they would say, that they're using the received word of God to then create a just society on earth, looking at Islamic principles, and not just Islamic principles, but their interpretation, the Shiite interpretation of what these principles might be.
Mm-hmm. And what about women?
Oh, well, of course, women are completely second-class citizens in Iran. I mean, you have to wear the hijab, you have to dress modestly, you're not getting paid the same as a man, the same types of jobs aren't open to you. They claim that women have all kinds of rights, but again, it's just a facade. Women, in fact, do not have great rights in Iran. Part of that is a cultural inheritance from being in the Middle East, but a lot of it is because these hardcore fundamentalist Shiite rulers just do not believe that women are the equal of men.
So if they wanted to have a constitutional amendment like the 19th Amendment, such as we have with our Constitution that gave women the right to vote, I mean, that they're not even allowed probably to petition to then go to a representative that's really going to have the ability to take that to somebody and say, the people want women's right to vote.
Well, they can try to.
Can they vote?
I think women can vote in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
But again, your vote isn't worth anything. It's easy to give out a right to vote if you control who the candidates are. If you look at elected officials, you don't really see a lot of women. There's some, I think, for propaganda value. But the idea that a woman could be the president of Iran or the woman could be like the supreme leader, forget about it. I mean, if all the power is really controlled by this group of religious authorities, and the religious authorities are all men, and no women are allowed, then it's easy to say, yeah, okay, have a few, ministries here or there, have a few, a little bit of representation, because they know that it doesn't mean anything.
So then if they wanted a change in the government, let's say it wasn't to vote, it was something different altogether, there isn't really a process for women or men to say, we the people are looking for our representatives because we want this in our neighborhood, or we would like to have change on this or that, or we'd like an amendment to the Constitution. Is there any process for that for them over there? I mean, that's really genuine, or even on paper or genuine?
No, any kind of change like that would have to come through the Guardian Council or the advisors to the Supreme Leader, or from the Supreme Leader himself. And they're not going to change the system because they run the system and they hold all the power in the system. So, I mean, under those types of what we would consider to be like a normal, like elective process or an amendment process or something like that, it's not going to happen. The only way that people can create change in Iran, or have tried to create change, is through some kind of mass action, like turning out in the streets, protesting, burning stuff down. I mean, they do this periodically every 10 years or so. There's like a huge series of riots. And that does, sometimes it leads to a little bit of reform, but not fundamental reform. It's not changing the system.
And last question, if the people came together and said, we want more freedoms, or we want more freedoms like America, we don't want nuclear weapons, things like that, that's just, I'm asking sort of the same question in a different scenario, but that's just not going to happen, correct?
No. I mean, the people per se don't really have any control over policy, and certainly not foreign policy of Iran. I mean, they could protest or something like that, but they really have no essential power to do anything like that.
So last question, with our Bill of Rights and our First Amendment, freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech, do they have anything like that in their Constitution? And out of those, do they really, I mean, they don't really have freedom of religion in its purest form.
No.
I guess they don't have freedom to petition, really. Freedom of speech, you can talk about. Press, probably not, right?
Not really.
What about petition? So to break those down very, you're doing a wonderful job at answering succinctly. Thank you. But let's talk about the comparison of our bill of our First Amendment, and which is essentially our declared rights and theirs.
Well, no, there's not really a comparison. I mean, when you like the Establishment Clause, for example, like we don't have established state religion, but that's all they have. I mean, their established state religion is the most important thing to them. It's what undergirds their entire system of government, is the fact that they have a state religion, and the state religion runs it. Free speech is limited. Freedom of worship is limited, and you can assemble maybe until the police break it up. So no, there's nothing really like our First Amendment. On paper, yes, you can read through their Constitution and see, it's like, oh, it looks pretty good. But again, that's just for propaganda, really. That's just to make them look like they're kind of a modern, more enlightened state, but in fact, no.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to toss to Tova. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again for being here and discussing this really important topic. I have tons of questions, so I'll dive right in. On this issue of women in Iran, there's recently been massive protests and mobilization of women across Iran advocating for women's rights. So could you talk about these recent protests, and is it just like the most recent display of phenomenon of protests happening over time, or is this something new? And are these protesters, what are they really advocating for? What does women's rights in an Iranian regime look like? Are they advocating for specific changes, or are they more like within the system? Are they more advocating for sort of the overthrow of the system in general? And do you see that it has any chance of maybe destabilizing the regime?
I think they're looking more for specific changes rather than overthrowing the system. Although if they could overthrow the system, I think that a lot of people engaged in these things would be in favor of that, because the folks who turn out in the streets to do this tend to be the more liberal, Western-leaning, kind of our kind of people. So it would be great if they could do that. But barring that, they just, would like to see change. But if they can't get that, then to make a testament to the world, because they know that this is being seen on video. They know this is being, gotten out to the West in some way, although the regime tries to clamp down on that and tries to control things like social media and the internet. In fact, Iran was trying to set up its own internet, like where it wouldn't even be connected to the world, to prevent people from finding out things like this. So I think what they're really doing is just trying to show the world, hey, we're here. We want our freedom. Please support us. And if they can't do that, then at least to make their own personal statements against the regime. And yes, periodically this happens. Every 7 to 10 years, you see this great upsurge of rioting and demonstrating and stuff. And then it kind of dies down because the security services come in and start hauling people away. And some of them you never see again.
And what are these specific changes that the protesters are advocating for?
I think they want to limit the powers of the morality police is a big part of it. I mean, a lot of this is social, allow women to have a lot more freedom, freedom of expression and freedoms generally. Freedom of speech, in fact, is a very important one to them, as well as the freedom to not have to wear the hijab, which is basically, that's more of a symbolic protest, but an important one. And then to a certain extent, it's economic, because Iran's economy has been beset by international sanctions and other issues like that. And as people find they can't run their businesses, or they have inflation, or they can't get gasoline, which is strange in an oil producing country, but in fact, they don't refine a lot of that oil. So this creates a problem in their economy, various things like that. And so you get different people going into the streets for different reasons. It might be food insecurity, it might be energy problems, it might be fundamental rights issues, a lot of things, and it kind of just all bubbles up.
I see. And then moving on to more foreign policy with regards to the US, it's very clear that the US and Iran have extremely sour relations. And, I once heard it said that Iran rests on two pillars, which is hatred of America and hatred of Israel, as in terms of gaining legitimacy. And so why is it that we have such a negative relationship with Iran, especially when we do maintain diplomatic relations with other, religious regimes in the area, like Saudi Arabia, for instance? What makes Iran so specifically such a challenge for us?
Well, you kind of have to go back to 1953 when there was a populist prime minister named Mossadegh, and he was causing some issues for Britain and for us. And so the CIA backed a plan to overthrow him and to give more power to the Shah. The Shah had been there, but wasn't as powerful. So now it's like giving the Shah the prime minister power. And so from then until 1979, we had a very good friend in Iran. I mean, the Shah liked us. He was a great ally. It was very useful during the Cold War because they were right there south of the Soviet Union, and that was all very good. But because of that, and because the US was seen as a supporter of the Shah, and because the Islamists hated the Shah, because he was a Western-leaning guy and a modernizer and all this, when Khomeini came to power, he popularized this expression called Margbar America, which, death to America. And that never went away. I mean, they chant this, death to America. They say it when they open their parliament. It's like, let's have a few minutes to chant death to America, and you hear it in the streets. There's even an emoji in their local chat app. There's a death to America emoji. I mean, they really don't like us. So, that's a problem for us in foreign policy, but we have issues with them too. They support terrorism. They have a terrible human rights record. They're very threatening to Israel, as you said. I mean, they call us the great Satan, and Israel is the little Satan. So, and they're pledged to the destruction of Israel. So I think that what the United States, and this is true of a lot of the hardcore, like radical Islamists, like the Bin Ladens of the world, like ISIS or any group like that, they look at America as really this degenerate, terrible, anti-Islamic place because of all of our freedoms. They really hate our freedoms because in their worldview, people shouldn't be free. They should be constrained to this very narrow conception of duty based on their theocratic principles. And sort of like all the freedoms that we enjoy to them is like, oh, you're completely immoral. You're terrible people. You're not doing the right thing all the time. So there's, the political issue there, there's the strategic issue, but there's also that moral issue where they just look at us as a bad example for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was mentioning before the call, I took a class called Islam in the Modern Middle East, and we looked at a range of thinkers. Of course, there's a huge variety about Islamic thinkers, but we did read, for instance, like Said al-Qutb, and like he wrote a book about going to America, and it was really interesting to see how he viewed all the freedoms we had as such a negative thing, that like, oh, they just totally have all this freedom and it makes them morally degenerate, which is like so different than how we view our freedoms within America. It was really fascinating. And then if I might ask a little bit of a, I guess, interesting question. You've worked a lot in like the intelligence community. How is how has the intelligence community come to view the CIA's decision to launch the 1953 overthrow of the figure in Iran? Like, do we still stand by that and kind of view that was a good decision? Or now looking back, do we think that maybe destabilized it and led to the Iranian Revolution later on?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I can't speak for the CIA, but I know that all that information was only recently in the last 10 years declassified, although everybody knew about it. I mean, Kermit Roosevelt, who was the person who undertook that operation, who was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, he wrote about it. I mean, it wasn't like it was a secret. I mean, I can give you my perspective. I think that it was okay in that it bought us a couple of decades of stability. And the problem wasn't so much that we backed the wrong person. I mean, the Shah, for all his problems, was less of a problem than what we currently have. At least he liked us. At least he was pro-Western. At least you actually had rights in that Iran. Our problem was we abandoned the Shah. I mean, President Carter kind of just cut him loose. And then that's what led to all of these bad things. So if anything, it wasn't so much that we destabilized Iran, as that we didn't follow through and keep supporting the Shah. It's kind of like how we didn't support our friends in Afghanistan recently. You know, we just kind of like cut out at some point, and then the Taliban came back in. So the United States, unfortunately, doesn't have a great track record of when our sort of developing world allies get into trouble, we tend to abandon them. And, you know, you can see that in Vietnam or other countries. And that's a shame. I think we should stand by our allies a little stronger when we can. But in the case of Iran, I don't know, it was a bad time for us too in the late 70s. So just another of the bad things that happened.
That's really fascinating because I've gone to a lot of different events at Harvard with like speakers from the foreign policy community. And I've actually heard that a lot this year. That specific refrain of like, after we go in and intervene in other governments, we don't have enough follow through. Like I've specifically heard that. So that's an interesting thing that I guess is to look at for the future of how we like conduct military operations. But I was also curious, looking from the Iranian perspective, what are their major foreign policy goals? What are they looking at to do in the region, and how do those goals impact relations with the United States?
Well, Iran seems to want to increase their influence in the region, the so-called Shiite crescent, like bring together the different Shiite factions. So it's like their support for the Syrian, for the Assad regime in Syria, because he's an Alawite, which is a sort of a Shiite type of Shiism. Support for anti-Israel groups like Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah, and kind of surrounding Israel strategically by giving support to groups in Gaza or in Lebanon. And then also they want control of Mecca and Medina, the two holy places. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the traditional Sunni Shiite conflict, some in the Iran government believe that they are the rightful heirs to, Muhammad, and that they should be the ones who control Mecca and Medina, not Saudi Arabia, which is why Saudi and Iran had problems for so long, although now they're making peace. But I think in the ideal world, from Tehran's point of view, if they could have control of Mecca and Medina, then, the world would be a much better place. So this is why Saudi feels so threatened. And also why things like you get like Iranians supporting the Houthis, rebels in Yemen, on Saudi's border, who are like firing missiles, at Riyadh. So basically, Iran seeks to just expand out their influence throughout that region, get in control of the holy places, destroy Israel. If they could have influence in Afghanistan, that would also make them happy. And, and then put down people like the Kurds and Azeris and the Baluchis and people who might threaten them.
Thank you so much. And then for my last question, I wanted to talk about the role of the Iranian military, and especially the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and others. How is their influence and relationship to the government different, like compare and contrast to the US military's relationship to the government of the US?
Right. Well, things like the IRGC is really like it's not an army in the sense that we have an army. I mean, our army is there in service of the state. We have civilian control of the military. Ideally, it's a citizen army and things like this. In their system, the IRGC is really the servant, not of the government, but of the mullahs and of the supreme leader. It's really like a direct line there. There's no government control over it. And so they really do whatever the supreme leader wants them to do. And they're very much involved in this idea of expanding the hegemony, expanding Iran's hegemony outward. Then there's like the Quds Force, which was in the news recently when we took out in 2020 the leader of the Quds Force, General Soleimani. They're the ones who are like active in Syria or active with subversion elsewhere or supporting terror groups or the other kind of things that they do. So, I mean, that's really the role that they play. And again, they're in a proxy war with Israel. You periodically see Israel like striking targets in Syria Well, those aren't Syrian targets. Usually they're Iranian targets, where Iranians have come in and like set up a command post or sending arms to Syria doing something. And then the Israelis do their intelligence work, they find the target, and then they take them out. So that, I mean, that's a war that's going on right now, although it's a little bit, it's a little undercover, but Iran and Israel are definitely coming to blows on a weekly basis.
Well, thank you so much. I could talk all day, but I want to pass on to Jewel, but thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, Doctor. Thank you for everything you've said so far. So first of all, what about this theocracy in Iran, as far as how does the institutional religion end up proliferating, as in who decides who's in charge of that? Where did it come from? Is it Iranian nationally, or is the religion outside of the borders of Iran? Because obviously we know that Islam is one of the major religions of the entire globe.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, the initial split between the Sunnis and the Shiites goes back, almost to the founding of the faith, and it deals with who the legitimate successor to Muhammad would be. Would it be a blood descendant, or would it be like a different group of people who would run the religion? And that, I mean, that's the fundamental split in Islam. And, it goes back centuries. So the fact that the Shiites, who are on the blood relation side of that argument, are concentrated in one place, I mean, that's just a historical fact that happened.
So the Shiites have an institutional structure that's inside and outside of Iran, and yet the Shiites have a leader who then pontificates to Iran's supreme leader and their other government officials.
Oh, no, the supreme leader is it. He's the leading Shiite figure. I mean, there are other Shiite sects and smaller groups, but basically in terms of Shiism, they look to the supreme leader in Iran for guidance.
Ah, okay. So then when normally we hear that primarily radical Islam comes from the Shiite sect, so they're looking to a leader who is in Iran, whether we're talking about a Shiite in Lebanon or wherever they may be.
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, there are always exceptions. And of course, there are Islamic radical groups on the Sunni side as well. Like Al-Qaeda was not a Shiite sect. It came more out of a different tradition. But on the Shiite side of things, yeah, generally they're looking to Iran.
So then so I'm Catholic, so we have a very clear structure into where who is in charge of what, down to right where I live, and I understand who's in charge of who, going straight up to the Pope. As far as and we don't have any theocracies currently on the planet which are underneath the Pope, besides Vatican City, which really isn't a theocracy in the way that you mean Iran is. So then when you say that their Shiite leader is in Iran, is it a structure that is from the outside we can't even look at and understand exactly? It's not like they have a written constitution within the religious sect of how these leaders are chosen, and how a Catholic has a pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, dioceses. They don't have something like that we from the outside can understand, or do they?
They do. No, they do. They have a religious structure of different levels of authority and religious schools where people go, and kind of a career path if you want to be an imam, and different things that they do. And yeah, I mean, it's very comprehensible as a hierarchy, and it's existed for hundreds of years.
And then is that one of the main, so in the areas of dispute, since what we've talked about basically is that the power of the Iranian government comes from its speaking from the word of God, at least their interpretation of what they claim is the word of God. So when there is a challenge, we look at our church history in Western civilization, and we had these clear challenges, and they've weakened, strengthened. There's a million arguments about what's happened since then. But in the authoritarian world of Iran, when there is imams that disagree, is that a political event? Is it something that we've witnessed, a split or a breakdown of power within Iran as different factions have had a religious dispute, the way that we did in Germany with Martin Luther from North and South Germany?
Those type of disputes, when they take place in Iran, they don't really translate into politics in the same way. It's more like kept within the religious authorities, and they might have debates over these things. And certainly they do have debates over these things, but it doesn't then become like where one political faction takes up one side and then another side, and suddenly the whole system is embroiled. It's more like they sort it out amongst themselves within the ruling group, and then life goes on. And so from the political standpoint, or like the social standpoint, people aren't really involved in that. It's more like an inside game with the clerics.
Interesting. So then when talking about how a religious structure can lend to then a political structure, Islam's political structure is much more interesting to me than what our other adversary is, which is the communism and socialist structure, because those structures are much, we can almost understand them much more clearly as Westerners, and we can understand their heritage somewhat more clearly as Westerners. In their structure, when they think about something as a person's private right to something that is an individual, how does their understanding as individual rights relate to their religious understanding of themselves? And does that make them lean towards what we would understand as a free market or a communist market?
I don't think they have the same concept of individual rights that we do in more Western liberal societies. It's much more of a communitarian thing. And to the extent that an individual has rights, they're only the rights that have been granted through the faith. It's more like you have a right to be a good person according to the rules. You don't have sort of a right to do what you want at all. That's just not their concept. You have a right to obey the law. You have a right to obey the religious doctrines. And if you fail to do that, then they'll let you know. So that's your freedom is the freedom to obey. So, it's a really kind of a different take on it. But the way that, since you mentioned it, like the different government structures, in all cases of where it's communist authoritarians or theocratic or some other type of authoritarian structure, they all kind of mirror each other in the way that they use control mechanisms. So, I mean, as your series goes on, you'll probably see that the structure that's in Iran is not that different from the structure of a communist party or some other type of authoritarian state, where you have this isolated group of elites who really run the show. And then they have all these bureaucrats who do the daily thing in the government for life. We don't really have a system like that. All of our stuff is very much interconnected. In their system, it's a little bit separate, but that's where the power is.
And then last question, what from their perspective, when they look back at history at the most recent Ottoman Empire, and I know that the Turks and the Iranians are not the same, what's their understanding of that? Do they identify with that at all? Do they see that as something the way that we would, depending on if we're looking back at our ancestor in Europe, let's say, and I have no ethnic relation to half of the things that went on in Europe, but if it's from the church, I identify with it, regardless of any other heritage not being shared.
Well, if you look back to the Ottoman period and the Sultanate and then like the Caliphate that they had, that was more in the Sunni tradition. And I don't think that the Persians really recognized that as having much, if any, authority over them. They had their own tradition. and their own thing that they were doing. But that caliphate, even though it was completely corrupt and didn't have a lot of power and wasn't like the caliphates of old, you know, we're talking about Saladin or something like that, but still the people like ISIS or Al-Qaeda on the Sunni side, or the Wahhabis, would look at that and say that was the ideal. And like when it fell in the 1920s, that was like the great tragedy of mankind, that unity within Islam, because whether you're Shiite or Sunni or any other sect in Islam, what they really want is for everybody to come together and have this great Islamic unity. So to the extent that there's an ideal out there that they want to see, something like that might represent it, even though in fact it was very flawed and it wasn't a unity at all. In sort of the myth of it, you know, the image of it, yes, that's something that they would love to see. And of course, in the case of Iran, they want to see an Islamic unity under Iran, right, under their Shiite leadership.
Okay, I don't know if I have to get to back to Kathy here as we're winding down. This is fascinating to get the be able to ask questions like this and have them answered. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all your great questions, Janine and Tova and Jewel. Now we have a few audience questions. And before I get to those, I just want to give a shout out to our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV, who are on 1060 AM. And this program airs Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific on KKVV in Las Vegas. So thank you for that. And we want to also give shout out to our students that are watching today, Hope Mucklow, Cami Waynehouse, and Noah Adamson from the North Island School. We've got students watching, and we always love to have our students on. And Hope Mucklow actually added a comment and said, this is very important and informative. One of the best constitutional chats. Thank you. So thank you,
Nice.
Dr. Robbins, for that. And this whole series was Janine's idea. So thank you to Janine for having such a great idea for a series. Now, Dr. Eric Braverman asks, references an article that ran in the Wall Street Journal, and it was on China and Russia encourage Iran to go nuclear. And I don't know if you've seen that article, but he says it was by, I can't really pronounce the name, but Garak and Takea. Are you familiar with that, but just generally, even if you're not familiar with that article, what about the influence of China and Russia on Iran? And where do you think that's taking us?
Well, of course, China and Russia are others of the authoritarians of the world, you know, other countries that have been under sanctions or what have you. China is very dependent on getting oil from Iran, and they want to promote Iranian nuclear aspirations in order to cause trouble. I mean, essentially it would cause trouble for us, for the United States, since we've opposed Iran getting nuclear weapons. And of course it would cause trouble for Israel, because for them, it's a life or death issue. It's, you know, for us, it's an inconvenience. For Israel, it's potentially the destruction of their country. So it's hardly surprising that that China and Russia would encourage Iran to move in the nuclear direction, because we would be the main target of something like that. Iran doesn't really have outstanding issues with Russia and China. They do have outstanding issues with us. And it's very important that we not permit Iran to get nuclear weapons, because that would severely complicate our standing in the Middle East. It would limit our options to do anything in the Middle East. And it would severely threaten one of our major allies in the Middle East, being Israel.
Well, thank you. And I don't know, did we lose Janine? Because I know if Janine was on, I think she might want to ask this last question. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it.
Okay.
One of the things that we like to talk about at Constituting America is Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, which requires that if a president negotiates a treaty, that the president has to bring it back to the Senate for ratification.
Right.
And we have negotiated some things with Iran in the past and called it an agreement. and not a treaty. And just wanted to get your opinion on that. And, you know, just if you think maybe it should have been a treaty or what your opinion is.
Well, in 2014, when President Obama negotiated the nuclear deal, he knew that that was a very unpopular deal. He knew that the Senate, there's no way the Senate would pass it. So they came up with this kind of hokey mechanism to get around that constitutional requirement. And essentially, it was an executive agreement between the President of the United States personally and the Iranian regime. Iran treated it like a treaty. But in fact, it was just an executive decision, not even an order, just a decision by the president on a matter of policy to agree to these conditions, not a binding treaty. When President Trump came in and said, okay, we're not going to abide by that deal, he was fully within his rights. Now, if it had been a treaty, it might have been more firm, right? I mean, it's very much in a president's interest to work with the Senate and find a good compromise on whatever the issue is and have a treaty, because treaties are binding. But President Obama used a shortcut. It was useless. President Trump threw it out. And now we're back at the table with the Iranians trying to come up with another hokey deal. Really, presidents should follow the Constitution, come up with a treaty. And if you say, well, I can't get a deal, well, then don't get a deal. It's either a good treaty or it's a bad deal.
Yeah, just to be fair, I mean, that's there have been presidents of both parties that have bypassed the treaty, and call them deals or call them agreements. But
yeah, and it usually fails.
Yes, yeah, ultimately it does, because it doesn't have the weight of a treaty, or it doesn't have the Senate's approval. So, well,
Right.
Thank you. This has been fascinating, and we're so appreciative of your time and appreciative of the audience and all the great questions, and just look forward to maybe having you back again sometime soon. And is there any word that you would like to say real quick to put a plug in for the international world?
Oh, yeah. On my school, Institute of World Politics, we're
Yes.
a graduate school of international relations.
Yes.
Here in Washington, D.C., a few blocks from the White House, a fully accredited school. We have master's degrees, we have doctorates. Many of our graduates go on to work in the government in high-level positions, and we're really plugged in. So if that's the kind of education you're interested in, look us up. It's at iwp.edu. We have an online program, we have an in-person program, and we love having people here, whether it's for credit or for enrichment or for any kind of education you want, or to hang out on Constituting America.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll see everybody next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern. We'll be talking about Saudi Arabia. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.